just give me screen sharing privileges?
Yes, let me fix that for you.
Oh, thank you.
Okay, we are ready to start.
Okay. I don't have a recorded script, so I'll just suggest that we open the meeting and we'll get started. I don't know, is David in attendance too?
I am, and I'm
Yes.
turning it over to Mike and
Okay.
Pat.
All right. Take it away, Mike.
Oh, thank you, Sean. So, good morning, everybody. I'm used to saying good evening at a commission meeting, but it'll start with good morning. I'll just share my screen here and kind of briefly go over our agenda for today. So this is really our first informational session. And I recognize some of the faces, some are new. I'm Mike Zuba with MP Planning Group. With me is Pat Gallagher from MP as well. We're partnered with Dave and Victoria on this project. So today's really our first informational session. We have topics of demographics, housing, and land use. As part of this, it's really kind of that first dive into a lot of the background information, not only kind of the state and federal data sets, as well as the information that we've gotten through interviews and other committees and commissions. It's kind of all rolled up into one. We have a pretty lengthy deck, but we'll pause between each of the major sections, and Pat and I will kind of tag team back and forth. So kind of, at each break point between demographics, housing, and land use, if you have any questions, you want to discuss anything, happy to get into that. And then we could do a wrap up and kind of roll everything together at the end if there's any questions, comments, or additions, subtractions that we want to be able to go through at that time. So with that, I'll kind of roll up our sleeves and get right into the demographics and housing. Pat, if you want to get us kicked off on the first demographic slide, that would be great.
Sure. Good morning, everybody. Pat Gallagher with MP Planning. So we'll start with demographics, and demographics is an area that really will influence just about every other topic we cover as part of this plan, whether it's housing, community facilities and services, infrastructure. It's all being looked at through the lens of your community's demographic trends. So starting with our overall population trends, overall Guilford has been quite stable since 2000 at between 21,000 and 22,000 or so residents. It saw a slight decrease in population between the 2010 and 2020 censuses, about 300 or so residents. And the latest population from the Department of Public Health show relatively stable population, again, staying at about that 22,000 person limit. One thing to note, we are using, which is fielded in April of 2020, so it may not necessarily reflect some of the trends we've seen in many communities since the spring of 2020, but we have sprinkled in some other data sets that should help paint the picture of some of those larger trends that are shaping the community over the last few years, more recent. So getting down into a little more detail, looking at our population components, there's really two ways your population changes. The first is natural change, so that's taking our resident births and subtracting our resident deaths. And so historically, Guilford was a town that saw positive natural change, so more births than deaths. You can see between 2000 and 2010, births exceeded deaths by nearly 300. But that over the 2010 to 2020 time period, where births have decreased significantly between from the decade prior, and deaths have increased slightly. So we actually had a negative natural change with deaths exceeding births by 431. The other component is net migration. So that captures net move-ins compared to net move-outs. So if we look at 2000 to 2010, Guilford saw positive net in-migration of nearly 700 new residents. And between 2010 and 2020, that has remained positive. And so net in-migration, but slowed quite a bit since the 2000 to 2010 time period. And that largely reflects housing. So between 2000 and 2010, you built a lot more housing units than you built between 2010 and 2020. And so housing is really tied to net migration, and Mike will cover some of those details in a little later. We will note that looking at the last 4 years, births are elevated slightly. So you've been averaging about 150 births per year but we're still well below the levels that we saw back in the 2000s, where we had some years over 220 annually. So that suggests that there was, but again, not a tremendous change in trends. So then moving into our age composition, this is a really important slide. This compares population change by age group, with the green bars representing growth and the red bars representing. And what you'll see is that the greatest increase was in the population age 65 years old and over, growing by over 1,700 residents. And that largely reflects that large baby boomer cohort aging into that 65-year-old and over category for the 2020 census. So as of 2020, 26% of your population is 65 years old and over, and an additional 17% between 55 and 64. And your median age is over 50 years old, which is much older than the state median of about 41 years old. And so this is important when we're talking about senior services in this plan, whether that's senior centers, senior transportation, or senior housing, certainly a growing demographic in your community. And that also corresponds with a loss in your kind of middle-aged adult population, age 35 to 54. And these are, traditionally your families with school-age children. And so that corresponds with our decrease in children under 18. We did see a small uptick in the young adult population between 18 and 34. And so if we get a little more detailed, so one of the previous chart just compares, 65 and over in 2010 with 65 and over in 2020. So it doesn't necessarily capture the migration piece that we talked about before. So we like to supplement that with a cohort analysis. And what that does is it tracks the same populations from census to census. So when we're looking at the 55 to 59-year-olds on this chart, we're comparing them to the 45 to 49-year-olds, the previous census. So this compares like with like. And what we can see here is that in the green bars, we can see the cohorts that actually grew from 2010 to 2020. So we're seeing an influx of families into the community. And again, this is not unlike what we've seen historically in Guilford. You're a town that's attractive to families. You have an excellent school system, and that's reflected in this data. There's just fewer people in that 30 to 49-year-old age cohort than previous years. Similarly, in red are the groups that we saw a loss in population as they age from one group to the next. And so we see a slight loss in age groups 50 and over, with the exception of the oldest, 85-year-old and over. And the biggest losses in your young adult population. So our high school graduates going off to college, but then also a loss in the 25 to 29-year-old age group. So suggesting that these young people are not returning to the community large numbers once they graduate. And so I think that's one of our questions for discussion is is this a lack of housing options? Is it cost? Is it lifestyle? Is it lack of proximity to jobs? All interesting points. Moving on to our next slide, race and ethnicity. So your town is becoming more racially and ethnically diverse. But as of 2020, about 89% of your population is non-Hispanic white, down from 92% in 2010. And we've seen the fastest growth among your Hispanic, Asian, and multiracial population. This is a similar trend as what we've seen statewide. These are the fastest growing racial and ethnic groups in Connecticut. And that's helped offset a decrease in your non-Hispanic white, which has decreased by about 1,500 residents since 2010. Household types. This gives a breakdown of your various household types in the community. About 63% consists of married couple family, reflecting your attractiveness to families. But we do see a growing number of single person households. So these make up now almost a quarter of your total households. And over half of these single person households are over 65 years old and over. And then the remaining households consist of single parent and non-households. So if we look at kind of age composition, 28% of households have someone under 18 living there, compared to 45% of households that have someone age 65 years old and over. So again, Guilford is seeing that transition maybe from school and child services more towards senior services. Next slide shows the change in household size. And despite your slight decrease in population, you actually saw a small growth in the number of households, and that largely reflects decreasing household sizes. So as household size decreases, you need more housing units, assuming your population stays stable. And so we do see a demand for new housing, even in situations where population may be declining. This shows, this chart here, that almost all of your growth in households was among one-person households. So that grew by 171, and we had either stable or household sizes for the remaining 30 household sizes. And so this is important because, again, this we look at in the context of housing. We have a growing number of one-person households, and so we need to think about ways of planning for some of those housing units that may be more cost-effective or appropriate for single-person households compared to the larger suburban-style housing that's prevalent in town. We also looked at school enrollment trends. This is a more recent data set and helps, again, provide some more recent data showing trends since 2020. And you can see in the chart that Guilford was on a declining trend for almost 20 years, and it reached a high of about 3,800 students back in 2007 and decreased to a low of about 3,100 students for the 2020 school year. But what we've seen has started to stabilize over the last 4 years, and especially at the lower elementary grades highlighted in that gold color there. Enrollment projections were prepared back in 2022, and they anticipate a modest uptick in enrollment to about 3,200 students by 2032-33, but again, not returning to those levels that you saw back in the mid to late 2000s. So to summarize our demographic trends, a stable population, shrinking household size. So that's leading to a growing demand for some new housing, and the growth in single-person households suggests a need for smaller housing units. An aging population will be an important component of this plan. How do we plan for that growing demographic and the changes that are required for that demographic? So senior housing, transportation, senior services, all are areas that is part of this plan. The demographics suggest that there is a need to plan for some housing growth and provide a range of housing choices that better align with your demographics, and Mike will touch on this in the next section. And then enrollment in your school system has largely stabilized with modest growth expected over the next few years.
All right, thanks, Pat. I'll just pause here if the commission has any questions on demographics. You could throw a hand up if and some of this may be covered and related to the housing, which we'll talk about next, and then that becomes related to the land use. So if there's no real pressing questions, I can keep moving along, but if there are, I can address those now. All right, we'll keep on trucking. All right, getting into the housing elements now. So kind of looking at housing stock, and this may not be a surprise to anybody here, but 85% of the household units are single family detached. So your traditional single family home within the community, and 85% of your units are owner occupied. The remainder is made up of a little bit of a mix of 2 to 4 family apartments, as well as 5+ family units and single family detached. About 6% of Guilford's housing units are seasonally occupied. And this is where we start to kind of look at the two data sets and really kind of start pulling things together. We do have a bit of a mismatch between housing unit size and household size, with 25% of our households contain one person, but only 10% of our housing units contain one bedroom. All right, getting into our housing permit activity, and I know Pat alluded to it a little bit earlier. When we look back at our record of housing permits and housing development, and this is just really a snapshot for about 20 years, a little plus or minus going back to the late 90s. We had a large amount of our permitting activity way back in the late 90s and really kind of into the early 2000s. That was predominantly single family, traditional subdivisions. as shown in the gold or orange color. And then you could see in the more kind of darker or more vibrant orange that multifamily, much smaller number of units that we're tracking there in the permit activity from the DECD. But I think between 2014 and 2023, about 23 new single family homes and about two new multifamily homes were the average per year. When you factor in the demolitions, which average about four per year, we're netting just over 20 units. We are recognizing that there's been several developments, since the last POCD in 2015. 66 High, the Muse, 2772 Boston Post Road, and then some single family subdivisions, especially those that are up more towards Route 80 and north, Great Hill Commons, Long Hill Estates, and then Northview Estates. And then there's always small little bits and bats of smaller subdivisions and infill developments that have occurred over that period of time. But the big takeaway is that your overall permitting and level of activity is much lower than it's been really kind of in the last 25 plus years. When we look at the census data and we dig into that ACS table of looking at the housing stock by year built, it's pretty clear to us that your housing stock is aging, especially when you look at the big picture of when a majority of your units were built. About 2/3 of your overall housing stock was constructed between 1950 and 1990. That's picking up the baby boom as well as the housing boom through really kind of that part of the mid 80s through the early 90s, where you really kind of peaked in your overall activity. But over the last 30 to 40 years, that has really kind of slowed down a lot. As land became a little bit more scarce, you're building less units because a lot of the more developable or readily developable land has already been built out on, and less than 10% of the overall housing units in town were built in the last 25 years. Looking into the MLS data, so this is information that we get through the Warren Group, which is just the MLS clearinghouse for all housing sales and all housing activity. This is an historic look back from 1995 through the full year of 2024, and this gives an idea of what that housing sales and what the activity of the housing market was. And really kind of the same kind of color combination with single family in that orange color, and then condo sales in that more vibrant orange color. So really back in the late 90s, peaking at almost 500 sales, really right around the turn of the century there, 1998, 1999. We saw a little bit of a drop off, but then you had that mini peak right before the Great Recession, where it was almost 450 total units. And then we had the Great Recession, which saw housing sales really drop off, and Guilford was a little bit of a lag there. The low was in 2011 at just 183 sales overall, but then the housing market activity began to pick back up, and then you had a period of stability really before the pandemic. So we'll kind of say pre-pandemic, even though I kind of hate that term, where you were averaging around 330 sales per year. And then you saw a little bit of an uptick at 350. So one of the things that jumped out to us was, and having done a lot of work in communities throughout the state, both on the shoreline and Fairfield County, Hartford Metro, and other areas, was that your spike for 2020 and 2021 weren't as high as some of the other communities. So we typically saw a lot of housing turnover, much more so than the prior years. That delta wasn't as great. And then typical to many communities in Connecticut that we see, really kind of the years following that peak in 2021, we've seen that stepped drop off, where 2022 was a little bit lower. Your 2022 level of total sales was just about on par with your pre-pandemic levels. And then really over the last 2 years, due to tightness of inventory, high prices, as well as the mortgage rates have increased, we saw much less housing activity. Looking at the chart below, is tracking that median sale price going all the way back to 1995. Median single family at 190,000, peaked then right before the Great Recession at just under 410,000, dropped back off, and kind of looking at that pre-pandemic level of median sale price for single family homes at 375 in 2019. That jumped up by $200,000 since then. So 575,000 at the year ending for 2024. Condos show a little bit greater variability, but prices are still up. It's just really a function. The chart looks a little more squiggly. That's just a function of the total number of units that get conveyed each year is much less than that of a single family homes, as you can see in the chart above. Looking big picture now, especially as we start talking demographics and housing needs, in any community, your demographic profile kind of is a good indicator of what your needs are in your overall community. But we recognize that housing needs vary by life stage and cycle. I think this chart does a really good job of kind of identifying, those different age cohorts that Pat was talking about earlier, and the typical type of potential housing needs that they have in a community that's predominantly single family housing with predominantly owner occupied. It becomes a little bit more challenging, especially to provide a housing typology for those that are on either end of that spectrum. We look at the young adults looking for, rental housing or smaller starter homes, more moderately priced homes to match their income and lifestyle. We don't really have a lot of that within the community. And then we look at a larger and growing population of those that are 55 plus that may be in those single family homes that are looking to downsize or have a little bit less of a lifestyle that's like wed to the house itself. And we don't have a lot of that on the upper end of that as well. So, where we're looking at those bookends, we don't really have a tremendous amount of housing opportunities there for those life stages within the community. Getting into affordable housing, and this was probably information that went through a lot of discussions as part of the drafting of your affordable housing plan. Affordable housing is determined based on the area median income. Then it does a little bit different dive where it has different levels based on the households. So I think there's always a disconnect in the public information of what affordable housing is and what that income level is, especially when you look at that area median income. In 2025, a family of four earning less than 91,000 may be eligible for affordable housing program. And I think, that becomes a little bit of a data point that I think the general public may not be aware of. I know a lot of times commissions and the Affordable Housing Committee in town is definitely aware of that, but it's just one of those things where I think that's surprising data point to many when you look at that income limit for a family of four within the community. Getting into affordable housing, and I remember it's part of the 2015 plan going through this calculation, and we're comparing 2015 in the chart on the right to 2023, and the numbers are very similar. Back in 2015, it was 2.43% overall of your total number of units, and this is counting those tenant rental assistance, government assistance, your chattel mortgages as well, and any units that are deed restricted. For 2023, that number dropped off by 1/10 of a percentage point. It's really driven by the loss of about 7 units that were chattel mortgages that have fallen off. So that really was the delta there. And familiar to some, but I'll say it as part of the meeting. If you have less than 10% of your units as affordable housing that meet the definition and fall within these different categories, you're subject to provisions of 8-30G unless you have a temporary moratorium. The Housing Authority, which has been in place since the late 60s, oversees 3 different developments. The 2 largest are Boston Terrace as well as Guilford Court at just 50 units, and then Sachem Hollow at 32 units. Guilford has adopted inclusionary zoning as well, requiring a set aside for affordable units or payment in lieu to the housing trust for new residential developments with greater than 2 units. And then last but not least, I believe it was in the latter half of 2024, your Affordable Housing Commission was established, and I do have information on their recent efforts and thanking them. I see some of them here for getting us that over to be able to include in this slide deck for today. So it's definitely much appreciated having that fresh information. So this was your affordable housing plan, penned back in 2021, probably 2022. It was accepted. This was statutorily driven through the state of Connecticut, requiring every community to have an affordable housing plan. And, these broad goals are goals that we're going to kind of look upon, see where we're at within there, and see if we want to make them current as part of our recommendations and strategies and action items. So I have it in here, but I'd rather spend a little bit of our time today talking about the Affordable Housing Committee's work and their strategic action plan. So looking big picture at that document and the work that they've been doing, and as I kind of alluded to earlier, public engagement, community information is key. A lot of people don't really understand affordable housing in Connecticut, and I think the informational component's huge as part of that through increased engagement and awareness. Some of their strategic action plans, basically rely on working outside the municipality, looking for regional and state agencies to support development of affordable housing, work with town agencies and others to identify parcels for potential development of affordable housing. I do know about 6 or 7 years ago, and it's still, I believe, ongoing, the Woodruff property down just south of the train station. There was a lot of work and effort put into that for the development of that site as affordable housing for those in town. Explore additional funding opportunities for housing development. I think one of the key challenges is that in the reality of economics, it can't be bore out by the developer itself. You have to be very strategic in how you're looking at incentives and how you're creating that, so it creates a welcoming development environment so that the public and private can benefit from it. Work with the planning and zoning to review and suggest zoning reg changes, explore potential developer incentives and permitting improvements, working on affordable housing, and coordinate with the POCD steering committee for including these components within the POCD update. And this just looks at their key strategies and priorities and the general overall time frame, kind of a mini action agenda for that Affordable Housing Committee's action items. Getting into permanent housing types, you've gone through a major rewrite of the regulations as well as some continued tweaking of those. And I think that's been a good process. And, we always encourage communities that we're working with that, your zoning regulations, you should be looking at those saying, are they meeting their intended purpose? If not, why so? And can we make some tweaks there to be able to make them to ensure that we're getting what we intended to as far as results out of the regulations themselves? So taking a look at these, residential mixed-use developments are permitted in several of your commercial districts, including some districts through site plan approval. Those that are following recent legislation, and we know it's made it through House and Senate. We'll see where the governor stands on it. But there's now potential to have residential and commercial as of right, pretty much. So let's kind of keep tracking that, and what we're doing for POCDs now is kind of watching that bill and seeing where it lands in July, and then we'll make any adjustments if necessary to kind of how we're planning for housing and land use as part of that. You include as part of the regulations inclusionary provisions for set aside. I mentioned that earlier, fee in lieu. I think one of the things we want to talk about a little bit deeper as part of this process, and that can become part of the goals and strategies as we move on. This is more of the discovery and data. Are the recent zoning reg update, are they giving you your intended results? Are the inclusionary provisions a financial hurdle for private development? Or are they working? Do you think they're going to work? Do we want to consider relaxing some regulations where we have special permit a lot? Should it be more of a zoning permit, administrative approval, and look at potentially expanding two-family outside of the R1? I don't expect any answers to all of these kind of questions we're just throwing out there now, but these are things that we'll keep in the back of our mind as we're kind of working through getting public input and talking through this process, things that we may want to consider putting out there to further study as part of this POCD. And kind of a teaser into one of our next data sessions, housing related infrastructure. We're going to talk a lot about infrastructure. There's been, one of the challenges is just the lack of sewer infrastructure overall in many communities, not just Guilford. You want to be able to align your housing densities with your ability to be able to treat on site. That has numerous components. That's a soil, that's a water table, That's lot size. You know, we know septic systems have become more and more challenged over the years. So just looking at that and how that aligns with the housing goals overall is going to be very important. Public water infrastructure. Some areas lack public water infrastructure, rely on private wells. That goes hand in hand with septic and on-site treatment. So really kind of understanding that relationship and how that then relates to land use and housing is going to be very important. And then those properties in the coastal zones, you know, we talked about as part of the 2015 plan. Significant number of homes are located within the flood zones. These are high risk. So just how those neighborhoods, not only from a flooding standpoint, but those also that higher coastal water table has an impact on those on-site septic systems as well. So just a little bit of a teaser there into when we get into that next topic in July. I just wanted to put in there as well some of the recommendations from the 2015 plan. Some of these have been moved along. Some of these are still very much relevant today. You know, these were the 5 major housing related items. So this is something that we'll want to be able to get some input on of like what we want to build upon, what kind of falls off, and where we kind of want to move forward with some of those, but just wanted to capture them in today's slide deck. And just to recap, before we move into land use, really kind of looking at that affordable housing plan and the Affordable Housing Committee strategic plan. Those are going to be 2 big pieces of information. We'll want to be able to funnel into here, but also then build upon it and say, you know, what do we want to be able to move in a different direction? What do we want to be able to tweak? Some of the items that we've talked about, you know, the support of the missing middle in housing types, as well as being able to help find support for housing for those that are, you know, on the opposite end of the spectrum, as well of looking at opportunities to keep those younger families within town, welcome young families into the community by having housing choices, and those older individuals that are aging out of their larger single family homes, provide a continuum housing for them. As far as new housing, promote energy efficiency and conservation strategies there. Bolster aging in place. I think universal design is going to be big. Making sure that housing is accessible regardless of age and status, and then continue to support and promote elevation of homes and other resilient strategies within those flood zones itself. All right, I'll throw the baton back to Pat, and if you want to kick us off with land use, Pat.
Sure. So this again segues with demographics and housing, looking at our existing land use in Guilford and seeing how well positioned is the community to, you know, meet some of these needs, and are there some challenges with just the built out nature of your community that may, you know, be a challenge that we have to overcome and kind of shape our policy. So as part of any POCD, we provide an updated generalized land use map that groups parcels based on their use using assessor data and aerial images. And we use the similar classification to the 2015 plan, but we did add 2 new categories. One for marine commercial, recognizing that it's somewhat of a unique land use, different from your other commercial districts. And then we've also added a mixed use category, recognizing that there's been some mixed use development out on the western end of Route 1. The next slide shows a summary table of the percent of land in each of the land use categories. So residential land uses make up about 43% of the total land area, a vast majority of which is single family. One thing that was notable that we found is that you have very limited amount of land in commercial and industrial land uses. So they make up less than 1.5% for commercial land uses and less than 1% for industrial land uses. And so that again tells us that you know, your property tax base is largely dependent on on your residential land uses. So certainly a consideration. Institutional land uses make up just under 2% of the land area. And where Guilford really, I think, shines compared to many communities is the amount of open space that you have. So about 22% of the town's total land area is what we're putting in our open space category. So that is inclusive of state open space, town-owned properties that are undeveloped, properties owned by the Guilford Land Trust and the National Audubon Society. And we'll do a deeper classification of this as part of our open space analysis when we get to the natural resources section in July. And then on top of that 22%, we also have nearly 11% of land that's owned by the Regional Water Authority, and another 2% that's owned by private organizations such as neighborhood associations or sportsmen's clubs that function as open space but may not have those same development restrictions as our town, state, and land trust properties. And then 7% of land is undeveloped, so what we're calling vacant land, and an additional 5% is used for agricultural purposes. And then a smattering of other land uses making up, less than 10% collectively. So we wanted to do a snapshot of development that's occurred since 2015. So about 550 acres have been developed since 2015. Most of that is single-family residential uses. But we also wanted to highlight some of the major projects here. So some of the major residential developments Mike had covered earlier, a mix of condominiums, townhomes, and some larger subdivisions in the northern part of town. And then also some major non-residential developments, such as Guilford Commons being the largest, and then some smaller commercial developments located on Route 1 and on Soundview Road. And then we're also showing our existing zoning, and this reflects those updates that you've done as part of your zoning rewrite over the last several years. So about 95% of your total land consists of residential zones. Again, aligns with our existing land use analysis, where you're a town whose tax base is going to continue to rely primarily on those residential land uses. And about 4% in your business zones, a smattering of mixed use, commercial, industrial, and special zones. And then we note our 2 associations, which have their own zoning authority there on the coast. So we're fortunate here to have a recent comprehensive rewrite of your zoning regulations, which does a really good job of establishing that overall land use vision for the community. In a lot of communities we work in, the zoning regulations have just been kind of added to over the years and doesn't necessarily reflect the latest thinking. So we could commend all the effort that's gone into that comprehensive process over the last few years. And again, we think that the zoning regulations have really been modernized to align with some of the current needs that the old regulations didn't address. And so we recognize that a lot of the focus was on business zones and housing diversity, as well as just overall streamlining of your process, reducing the number of zones where applicable. And so we're noting here the establishment of the post road business zones, consolidation of mixed use zones and industrial zones, establishment of a new Guilford Green Zone and Marine Commercial Zone. And then, as Mike had mentioned before, broadening permitted housing types within your residential and business zones, including mixed use and residential developments. And then also incorporating that planned development district tool to provide some greater flexibility on individual sites as needed. So when we look at our existing land use and our existing zoning, we want to look at opportunities to meet some of the needs that are going to be identified as part of those, as part of the plan, whether that be housing, economic development, community facilities. All of those needs need land. And so an important part of any plan is to do a developable land analysis. So what we did is we took both vacant land and any agricultural property, and then subtracted out any area that was encumbered by wetlands or flood zones or water bodies. And what that leaves us is about just over 2,500 acres of undeveloped or agricultural land that is free of natural resource constraints. And about 91% of that land is residentially zoned, and about 3/4 of that land is in the R8 zone. So primarily north of Route 80 in the R8 zone. And about 82% is located north of I-95. So much more limited development opportunities on vacant land within and surrounding Guilford Center. And the only exceptions on the Route 1 corridor really being on the west end north of I-95. So this is just our takeaways and discussion here. So again, our development opportunity is primarily residential and primarily in those lower intensity R8 and R5 zoning districts. So You do have the land to meet any single family housing demand for the foreseeable future. But when we look at some of the other zones that are more permissive of a range of housing types, we find a lot less available land. We have about 9% of land remaining, or developable land in business zones. We do have a sizable amount in the mixed use zone on the west end of the Route 1 corridor. So we see that as kind of a prime area for meeting some of those housing needs that we discussed earlier. And then we also have the State Street North Zone, also an area that does allow some broader housing types. And then another thing we noted is limited opportunities for industrial development with just 26 acres of developable land. And we recognize that many of your industrial zones are up against the coastal marshes. And so flood risk is certainly something that encumbers a lot of that undeveloped land, and also maybe a risk for existing businesses that may be in the flood zone. So something to, again, think about how resilient are some of these business districts that, you know, are a small but important part of your tax base. And then overall, and as I alluded to before, you know, south of I-95, we really have very limited vacant land. And so when we look at our development policies and actions, it's really going to be focused more on infill and redevelopment and adaptive reuse, while we have some more opportunity for greenfield development or development on vacant land in the areas north of I-95. And so just to kind of plant some seeds for further discussion as part of this process, again, we commend you guys for undertaking that, you know, massive effort of updating your regulations in a comprehensive fashion. And again, we think that establishes a clear vision and is a great jumping off point. And like Mike had mentioned in the housing section, you know, I think the POCD is really an opportunity just to plant the seed for any potential tweaks you may want to make to those regulations as part of any future amendments. One thing that we've kind of noted as a placeholder is that, so your zoning regulations require that a planned development district, so again, that flexible zone that permits a range of housing types, be cited in accordance with the plan of conservation and development. So we want to make sure that this plan defines, you know, locations and or criteria that can be useful to you all as you are considering citing those future plan development districts. And as I noted before, when we're looking at our development opportunities, we have, you know, most of our development opportunity in our lower intensity residential zones, but we do have some opportunities for additional multifamily and mixed use development, primarily in that mixed use and the State Street North zone. And so focusing on our commercial and industrial zones, you know, again, the limited amount of available vacant land really means that the policy should consider, you know, pursuing highest and best use on, you know, what limited land we do have left, but also looking at highest and best use as part of any adaptive reuse or redevelopment opportunities as well. And that's primarily going to be the focus on the neighborhoods south of I-95, within and surrounding Guilford Center, as well as the eastern part of Route 1.
Thanks. Pat, do you want me to take us through the community structure?
Sure.
Sure. And, you know, I think we mentioned earlier, as part of the open space, we'll have some greater stratification there of what that open space land looks like as part of that topical presentation when we get into natural resources and conservation. So getting into community structure, as part of any POCD, you really should have a future land use plan, which is kind of your vision for the community overall. You could have a vision statement, but the future land use plan is really kind of forward-looking of what your desired development patterns look like for your community. So we always like to be able to get a little starter for that and begin looking at some of the key areas in town, your nodes, your corridors, how they interrelate to each other, how they overlay on your land use. So this little simplistic community structure plan kind of takes a look at Guilford, identifies the various gateways within your community, whether it's the gateway from the north from Durham, or your east-west gateway along the Route 80 corridor, right in that upper 2/3 of your community, going all the way down to the Route 1 corridor on the western end of town where Pat mentioned, within that gateway, we have development potential. There's been a lot of rezoning effort there. Your gateway on the eastern half of town, along the line of Madison, and then down along Route 146, that gateway there as well. And then looking at nodes, Guilford Center, the green up to Route 1, all the way up to probably the interchange there, and then slightly to the south is really the primary hub of the community. That's your major node. Then we have some smaller secondary nodes along the Route 1 corridor. And this just gets us thinking about land use structure where we have development potential. And this kind of lines in with what we were talking about as far as your PDDs will be guided by the criteria established in the POCD. So we want to be able to keep all these things in the back of our mind. And then a little later on, as we start talking about conservation, we want to be able to keep that community structure in the back of our mind as well, because that's going to have a big influence on the future land use plan as part of your next plan of conservation and development. So with that, I'll turn it over to commission. I think I skipped questions on housing section. We roll right into land use, but let's go back through and let's have some discussion on any of the items that we have and any broader questions that we may have as part of the process.
John, you're on mute.
Right. So thank you, Mike, and thank you, Pat. Are there any questions from any of the commissioners in attendance?
Oh, you're referring to a document. I haven't seen this document.
Which document is that you haven't seen?
What you just were referring to and reading from.
The presentation, you mean, Ted?
Was there anything besides the agenda that was given to the commissioners prior to this meeting?
No. But we will post this presentation on the POCD website so that you can refer to it. We can also probably email it if it's not too large.
I think it would be helpful. I mean, it was an interesting, fast-paced presentation, but frankly, when you refer to this chart and you refer to that, and I don't have it in front of me, it doesn't do much good.
Our apologies on that. I didn't realize that nobody saw the document ahead of time. But if there's once it comes out and gets in your hands, I know it was a lot of information. We used a lot of planner speak. As part of our working sessions in July, we'll have some time planned at the beginning of each of those to kind of revisit the demographics, housing, and land use. Once you have a chance to dig in, we can reserve some time at the beginning of that meeting to address any questions, comments, or additional information as part of that. I think that would, really kind of help, because I do realize that it was a lot of information we kind of gave you in a short period of time.
And Mike, if you could email me the final presentation, I'll just send it to the commissioners.
Will do.
Thank you. Mike, this has been very helpful, and I appreciate Ted's request that we all get a copy of this. Are there any updates on the how the responses have been going to the survey?
I'll turn that over to Dave and Victoria. I know they've been tracking the survey. So Dave or Victoria, if you want to give us an update on that.
Victoria, if she's able to, can do that. We were chatting about it earlier and she was going to call in. There she is.
Yep, I'm
She's
here. Yeah, so we are up to 84 responses, and we saw a pretty good bump after we had the last public workshop, which is good. So that means folks that attended the workshop participated and, hopefully distributed some info. So definitely still a ways to go, but I think, 85 is a good start. So
Yeah, okay. And I would just encourage commissioners to encourage their friends and neighbors and any acquaintances that they have to complete the survey. And if they haven't done so themselves, please do so.
Thanks, Sean. And I do want to make a note too. Back in May, we had a workshop during the week at the community center. It was well attended. We had various stations. We got a lot of feedback on various areas from that. And then there's a workshop in a couple weeks
Right.
as well. And that's more, it's geographically located up in more North Guilford, but it's open to anybody within the community. It'll essentially be similar information that we had at the community center a couple of weeks ago. So if you missed that chance, feel free to pop up there, attend that workshop. I believe it's on the morning of the 28th. Is that correct? Yeah, I
Yep.
see Victoria and Dave nodding. So that's just another opportunity to be able to put some sticky notes on a board, give us your thoughts across various areas. You know, this real first part of this process, we're building a bank of information, and that's, you know, both published sources, that's both local knowledge, institutional knowledge. We want to hear from the community as much as we can. So any chance that you know, the commission could act as ambassadors to help spread the word, whether you're grabbing coffee, grabbing a bite to eat, to be able to get that information out there, it would be much appreciated.
Yep. Thank you. Thanks, Mike.
Yeah.
I believe that workshop, the next workshop is, if I'm not mistaken, is at the Guilford Firehouse
Yes.
Yes, it
Correct.
is.
in North Guilford. Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
At 11 a.m. on the 28th.
Right.
Larry has his hand up.
Yeah, thanks. I was wondering if you had looked at other changes we might make, say with infrastructure, if we were to extend water lines, where would be the best place to do that? If we were to change a zone, say from R5 to R4 or something, where would be the good place to do that, if there is such a thing? How would you change what we're already doing? The most bang for the buck if we were to make changes.
Yeah, I kind of like that highest and best use thought and approach of kind of how we're looking at everything, Larry. That's a great question. You know, I don't think we're ready yet to say exactly, because we haven't gotten through all of the information yet of where we're going to make some more of these ambitious and transformational changes. But I do know as part of the next series in July, we're going to begin really kind of talking about infrastructure, looking at, you know, where that is, how it relates to what we've talked about today with the land use. And I think coming out of that is where we're going to be then kind of strategizing about, do we want to expand infrastructure? Does that allow us then some greater densification through zoning? And that's where we kind of start pulling all that together. But I like that you're kind of getting ahead of it a little bit in your thought process.
Right, thank you.
Thanks, Larry.
Sean, I've got a question relative to the project as a whole, rather than the details. Some of us, Sean, Bill and I have been closer to the, you know, the administration of the work of the consultants, but our other fellow commissioners have not. And I think it'd be useful at this point to, if the consulting team could assess broadly how you feel where we are in the process, and are we on track? Are we typical of what other cities and towns have been doing relative to this work? And ultimately, where do you see this wrapping up? Obviously, some months down the road.
Yeah. Dave, do you want to tag team this one with me?
Yeah, certainly.
I mean,
I-
what Roger's basically saying, give us your sense of how we'd be doing if we had to score a report card.
All right, it's the end of school. You know, we're on to the summer now, so it's a good
Okay.
timing for a report card question.
Yep.
Roger and Sean. So you know, this was a massive amount of information. So in the beginning of a POCD, you want to get some outreach. We got the survey out there. We'd like to have some greater number of survey responses, to be honest with you. So I kind of encourage you as ambassadors to the process, really help us get the word out. We have a pretty aggressive schedule over the next month and a half to 2 months of getting through data and information where you're going to see numerous decks like this, getting that information together. And then it really becomes in the fall, it's going to be that plan development and strategies, right? So I think we're in good position for that. Considering when we started this process and where we're at today, we're right on track with where we need to be. I don't always kind of grade a POCD based on expediency. I grade it on really the quality of it, and are we challenging the community and the commission to kind of think outside of the norm a little bit, as well as being respectful of kind of the history of the community. You really grade a POCD in the first couple years to see how it's kind of performing. Did we touch on the right things? Are we being progressive where we need to be progressive? Are we conserving where we need to conserve? And only time will tell when the document's adopted of how it really kind of got a grade. But I think from a timing standpoint, we're doing quite well. I'll put us kind of up there at the head of the class.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, we're coming up on 11 o'clock. Are there any other questions from any other commission?
I see Bill has his hand up, and
Yeah,
Larry just had it.
Hey, I'm Bill Freeman. I was just sort of wanted to ask a little deeper question about what Larry brought up about zone changing. Has this been a strategy that you've seen used in the past where you might take an R8 zone and downgrade it or upgrade it, depending on how you look at it, to allow for denser housing? Because it clearly at almost 2,100 acres of land between R5 and R8, that seems to be the most logical way to increase housing in the town. And I don't know if you could sort of give me your opinion on how has played out for others, or if it's something that actually doesn't get done very often. Thank you.
Yeah, I can provide that. And if anybody else, Pat or Dave, wants to chime in, I think the POCD is a perfect time to be able to test the waters for something like that. Once you're in, you want to really kind of look at all of the factors before you get into making a decision such as that. And I think that's what we've started to do. We started to look at your developable land. We started to look at your constrained land. We've identified clear housing needs within the community itself. We're putting a body of information together where we could be thoughtful about that discussion and decision making if we're going to do something like that. And I think this is the perfect place to work through and discuss it. When you look at your R8 zone, very large lot, I can't recall how long it's been in place, but I know it's been in place for a while. It's where a lot of the land resides. You want to be smart about and wrap some criteria around. If we're going to consider creating greater density there, what would that look like? And then I believe it becomes a process of looking at all of the zones within all the zones that have some development potential, seeing if there's any opportunities there, without actually going through and rezoning it. So the POCD is going to make some recommendations. Some may be suggestive in nature, some may be very pointed. And then that's really going to rely on the commission, the Affordable Housing Committee, to kind of, and we'll give responsible parties to move that along, but we're going to give you the framework to do that. But the POCD doesn't have any real regulatory teeth. It's only a guidance document that's going to rely on an action to happen afterwards to be able to do that. Does that make sense?
And I
But
would
I
add
think
too
there's-
that the PDD criteria is going to be a really important part of this
Yeah.
process, right? Where it's like, housing, higher density may not be appropriate everywhere in R5 and R8, but there may be some selective areas that meet certain criteria that we can establish as part of our process that you may want to consider, if someone ends up landing that. So it's already a tool at your disposal. It's just, I don't believe it's been landed anywhere yet. But it is something that allows some discretion, but while also providing some flexibility.
And I think too, as we kind of watch the fate of what the exact housing bill is going to look like with the governor's actions in the next, coming days and weeks, we're building the body of work to be able to position Guilford so that, you know, you're in good stead with that, but also in control of your own destiny to be able to do that. And I think that's important as part of this process. So it's kind of a weird time to be talking about that because we really don't know what's coming down from Hartford. So I'm trying to kind of balance it a little bit. But I know in July we'll have a much stronger idea once we look at where that finally lands. We've reviewed it a lot, the legislation, the bill, gone through all 2,000 plus lines of it. So it's just seeing what stays in, if all of it, if any of it, if something gets modified, and then we'll be able to get a little bit more specific on a lot of that and how best to position what we're recommending here. I see your hands are still up, Bill and Larry. Do you guys have an additional question, or was that just left up from the last round?
No, I had a local question and a regional question.
Okay.
In terms of the information we've gathered, the Affordable Housing Commission gave a nice document of what it's thinking about and where it wants to go. Do we have anything from Economic and Development or Land Trust, or because these would impinge on what we think about in housing, conservation, other parts of the plan were not a focus today. So how good has the response been from these other commissions? And do we need to get on their tail a little bit to be visionary with us?
We had everybody at the table, and I believe it was back in January, Dave. Was that when we had some questionnaires and interviews, and then we've had some follow-up? And
Correct.
we're going to touch on those topics in the coming month. And we're going to do deeper dives there, but it's just really kind of, as we start to, in my experience, as we start to talk strategies and we start to talk actionable items is where we really ramp up the input. So it's like kind of, what have you been doing? What are your priorities? A lot of what comes out in the plan is being able to address competing interests. And you always have some competing interests in any given community. And it's being able to have the rationale around what direction you're going, realizing that not every item in a POCD or action in a POCD makes everyone happy. It becomes a balance.
I was looking for how do we integrate, not as a battle between silos, but
it's not a battle.
Silos.
I've seen it before where there may be a given property identified. It's desirable for this, it's desirable for that, but it's being able to have those conversations so you could see both sides of the coin. And I think that's why we're all here as part of the POCD, is to be able to look at those different areas of interest and get a broader understanding for the community good, right?
And then my other question was regional. Our COG, our local COG, has a regional plan. And at what point do we start looking at that, and how do we integrate with the regional? When do we start thinking regionally?
Yeah, that's a good question as well. So as part of the process, we're going to go through consistency with the regional and state plan. So I kind of teased it at the end with this community structure plan. That's the kind of start of our future land use plan. So as we look at land uses, we look at goals and strategies, both regionally and state, we're going to see where we're in alignment and where we're not in alignment. And then that's going to ask the question of, do we want to, did Scrog bring up a good point on such and such that we may want to consider? And that's where you begin to kind of like pull it all together. Right now, we'll broadly call it just kind of like the discovery topics. We're looking at all the data, but we're not really yet getting out there and saying, this is what we think we want to do. When we see the full picture, because we still haven't talked with everyone here on, a lot of the other topical areas, and that's where we bring in those other things that, competing interests and balancing and understanding all of that. That's where, in probably the midpoint to the latter half, really look at alignment with the state and regional plans.
Yeah, it just seems I'm wondering if our stated goal of the end of the year is reasonable. It sounds like that's a lot of work. And
it is a lot of work. And, I always look at it this way. I mean, I've been doing POCDs for 25 years. You don't let the timeline dictated by the 10-year process
Mhm.
drive the plan. You're conscious of it, but it's your plan and you only do it once every 10 years. If it takes a little bit longer to get the right plan together and get the right input, it's a hard process to rush. You
Mhm.
take a little bit longer to do so. And I think that's the importance of it because you really only get one crack at it every 10 years.
Yeah, so we are not operating, and I'm glad you asked the question, Lori. I'm glad you answered it the way you did, Mike. We are not operating under a hard and fast deadline. There's not a date out there. It's not December 1st. It's not December 15th. It's not, Mike, I'm glad you made that point. This is our process. It's the community's process. We do want to, keep it moving forward, but there may be a juncture where we just have to say this is going to take just a bit longer because the inputs are informing us in ways that we really have to take it into account in any kind of final document. Make sense, Mike?
100%. And I think, and it's funny because you always look for the right time to engage folks, and it's always like a reason to not have a right time. That's why when you look at a POCD, you want to have that sufficient time in the process to be able to allow people to plug in, plug out. They're not engaged in it every day like we are, actively working on it, but we want to be able to have that input. We understand people have a lot of other things going on in their life, and whenever we can be able to get a chance to be able to engage folks and get info and get information. And, we know there's a lot of great groups in town that are doing a lot of different work on different timelines. So, a POCD isn't such a streamlined from point A to point B kind of plan. Very few plans are. Planning becomes this more incremental, less organized kind of like informational process that you need to be able to have time to be able to get that input on. And I think it's important to have a good plan and one that really sets you up well for 10 years versus saying, we got it done within our statutory timeline. We're on the good list at the state. It's like, it's my understanding the state has never punished anybody for being late on a plan that asked for an extension. So I think, when it's warranted, you do that and you follow your process.
Makes sense. Thanks, Mike. Are we prepared to wrap up? Is that we covered what you wanted to cover, Mike, Pat?
We got through everything, and I think what we'll do, Sean, is we'll get that deck out, and then we could leave some time to touch on questions. I know there's a lot, and as we move along with the process and start talking other topics, we'll start to see the interrelatedness and the conversations become a little bit more and more robust and pointed, which is what typically happens. So we're looking forward to that part of it.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Unless there are other questions from commissioners, or if Dave and Pat have any final comments, I am going to suggest we adjourn.
Mr. Chair?
Yes.
I know this is not a public hearing, but you may want to consider taking comments from the public because this is another opportunity for the public to weigh in.
Do we, and then how many members of the general public are in attendance?
We have about maybe 8 people.
Okay, well, I will certainly entertain questions from any members of the public if they would like to raise their hand. There being any? Hi.
Say thank you. I thought that was a terrific presentation, and I think that you really identified the challenges with the locations of housing, the PDD criteria, and the amount of wet stuff we have downtown. So I'm looking forward to the next steps. Thank you.
Thanks, MJ.
I wanted to say what MJ was saying about the land use identification, the potential developable spots. That's really extraordinarily helpful to us as a part of the Guilford Affordable Housing Commission. I also wanted to say last night we had a movie shown at the a video shown at the library. And as I had mentioned in your regular meeting, I was able to include a reference to the plan of work that you're doing and mention the Firehouse upcoming workshop as well as this one just for viewing. If we can help you in any way to promote and get out, because that's kind of part of our mandate is to do community conversations. And if we can show the recording of this meeting, we can plan a community conversation around it, and anything else. So maybe we could talk about that offline if that makes sense. But we could, I just throw that out there for your thoughts, consideration.
Thank you. Appreciate
Thank
that.
you.
Is there anyone else who would like to speak on the record?
Okay,
Yes.
then I would, I'm not sure we need to vote, but will make a recommendation that we adjourn. All right.
Sounds good.
Okay, thanks, Roger. Thanks all to Bill and Larry.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.